Imagine a different America. An America where the sound of train whistles echoed from coast to coast, where grand stations bustled with travelers, and where steel rails stitched together a nation that was still figuring out who it wanted to become. For nearly a century, the United States didn't just use railroads, it dominated the world with them. It built the largest rail network in human history. Railroads were the engine that pulled America into the modern age, the backbone of its economy, and the symbol of its rise as a global power. And yet, in a twist almost too ironic to believe, this same country, the birthplace of the railroad tycoon and once the undisputed rail superpower, would eventually become one of the only wealthy nations without a true high-speed rail system. Not because it couldn't build one, but because of a series of decisions that set the nation on a completely different path. In the late 19th and early 20th century, railroads were America's lifeline. They weren't just transportation, they were nation building. They connected remote towns to growing cities, opened entire regions to commerce, and created fortunes that shaped American politics and society. But hidden within this golden age was a quiet turning point, one that wouldn't become obvious until decades later. By the 1960s, when Europe was still running conventional trains, the US actually jumped ahead. In 1967, the Metroliner hit 125 miles per hour, a speed impressive enough to turn heads around the world. And by 2000, a Acela Express reached 150 miles per hour. Numbers that suggested America could easily become a leader in fast rail travel. But reality told a different story. Those speeds were only possible on a tiny stretch of track, just 54 miles. The infrastructure underneath was aging, congested, and never designed for true high-speed service. The US had the technology, the money, the engineering talent, yet somehow couldn't build a nationwide system. Something much bigger was going on. The real pivot, the moment America changed course, arrived in 1956 when President Dwight Eisenhower signed the Interstate Highway Act. It became the largest public works project in U.S. history, creating the most extensive highway network the world had ever seen. In just a few decades, America transformed into a car-first nation. Suburbs exploded outward, cities redesigned themselves around parking lots, drive-throughs, and wide boulevards. The automobile didn't just provide mobility, it became part of the American identity. And as cars took over daily life, passenger rail collapsed. By 1971, what remained of the once mighty passenger system was consolidated into a single government-supported company, Amtrak. But Amtrak was never treated like a national enterprise meant to grow or compete. It was more like a hospital ward, created not to advance rail travel, but to keep the patient barely alive. So where exactly did America go wrong? From a systems perspective, the answer is simple but profound. The United States built its rail network for freight, not for people. The country optimized for long, heavy trains carrying goods across thousands of miles, not for sleek, fast passenger service. Europe and China made the opposite choice. They prioritized people first. And once a nation commits to one direction, the foundation becomes nearly impossible to reverse. This is the root of the American paradox, a wealthy nation with the technology and resources to build high-speed rail, yet stuck in a transportation model that makes it incredibly difficult. The question isn't whether America can build high-speed rail. The real question is, what forces are preventing it from happening? To understand that, we have to dig into the structural barriers, geography, politics, culture, and sheer cost that stand between the United States and a high-speed rail future. And that's exactly where we're heading next. If America's railroad past explains how we got here, then the present explains why we're stuck. Because when you look beyond nostalgia, and start examining the reality of building a modern high-speed rail network, you discover that the United States isn't fighting one barrier, it's fighting four. Four enormous structural obstacles that, together, make the idea of American high-speed rail feel less like a transportation project and more like a moonshot. And the first barrier begins with something America simply cannot change. It's geography. Barrier 1. Geography and demographics. The map that works against America. Compared to Europe, the US is almost the same size. But where Europe has dense clusters of cities within 300 or 400 miles of each other, the United States is defined by distance and emptiness. High-speed rail thrives only under very specific conditions. Major population centers, separated by roughly 150 to 500 miles apart, with millions of people in between. Europe has this everywhere. China has it across the entire eastern half of the country. The United States? Almost nowhere. There is exactly one corridor in the entire nation that fits the global pattern: the Northeast, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. Four cities forming a dense chain of people, jobs, and economic activity. If America ever had a natural home for high-speed rail, this was it. But outside of this narrow strip, the picture collapses. The Midwest stretches into vast agricultural plains. The Mountain West is nearly empty for hundreds of miles at a time. And the Sun Belt sprawls outward horizontally, not vertically, with cities built miles apart. Try connecting Chicago to Denver and you run into 1,000 miles of near-empty land. Connect Los Angeles to Phoenix and you hit the problem of low urban density and enormous suburban sprawl. Even the most promising corridor, Dallas to Houston, has the right distance, the right population, and the right demand, but gets trapped by a different barrier entirely, a barrier far more frustrating than geography. Barrier 2, politics and permitting, America's slowest moving machine. If geography is the natural limit, politics is the man-made one, and it's arguably even worse. The United States has one of the slowest, most complex infrastructure approval systems in the developed world. Building anything, a bridge, a power line, a wind farm, requires navigating a bureaucratic maze of federal, state, county, and city governments. High-speed rail, with its massive land footprint and environmental impact reviews, is the final boss of that system. A single rail project can require approval from 3, 5, or sometimes even 7 layers of government. Add to that the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, which mandates exhaustive environmental reviews that routinely stretch 5 to 10 years. And even when the paperwork is done, the lawsuits begin. Local residents sue, businesses sue, counties sue, agencies sue each other. Projects freeze for years, sometimes decades. Compare this with the rest of the world and the difference is almost absurd. In China, a high-speed rail line can go from approval to construction in 6 to 12 months. In Europe, it's closer to 2 or 3 years. In the United States, the timeline can easily reach 10 to 20 years before a single bulldozer touches the ground. And nowhere is this dysfunction more visible than in California. The state's high-speed rail megaproject, once promised at $33 billion, has ballooned into $128 billion, and the first segment is running more than 15 years behind schedule. Not because Americans can't build trains, but because the American system makes it nearly impossible to build anything fast. But even if politics suddenly became smooth and efficient, America would still face a cultural barrier, one almost unique to this country. Barrier 3, car culture, freedom on 4 wheels. If you want to understand why high-speed rail struggles in America, you have to understand the American relationship with the car. It's not just a vehicle here, it's identity, it's freedom. It's the American dream with an engine and a steering wheel. 92% of American households own a car, one of the highest rates in the world, and the entire built environment reflects that. The US has the largest highway system ever constructed.
Cities are designed around wide boulevards, massive parking lots, and sprawling suburbs that stretch 20, 30, even 40 miles from the city center. If you don't drive, you don't move. High-speed rail thrives only when millions of people prefer trains over cars. But in the US, the car isn't just convenient, it's normal, it's expected. People drive to work, to school, to the grocery store, to pick up coffee, to visit friends, to go anywhere. Which leads to a blunt but accurate observation. America doesn't lack money for high-speed rail, it lacks demand. And until Americans willingly trade car keys for train tickets, any high-speed line would struggle to attract enough riders to survive. Yet, even demand is not the final barrier. Because even if America wanted high-speed rail, and even if the politics aligned perfectly, the fourth obstacle might be the hardest of all. Cost. The American price tag problem. No matter what you build in the United States, a road, a subway, a tunnel, you'll notice something alarming. It costs far more than it does anywhere else in the developed world. High-speed rail is no exception. Building 1 kilometer of rail in the United States can cost 3 to 7 times more than in Europe. And there's a long list of reasons why. Sky-high land prices, strict labor rules, heavy safety regulations, powerful unions, legal challenges, extremely expensive property acquisition, layers of compliance and oversight. The consequences are shocking. New York City's subway extension, just 1.6 miles long, costs $4.5 billion. Meanwhile, China can build a mile of high-speed rail for $20 to $30 million. In America, every foot of track feels like a small fortune. When you put all 4 barriers together, the geography, the politics, the car culture, and the cost, the conclusion becomes painfully clear. America's problem isn't engineering. It's everything else.
If the United States keeps running into walls, then the obvious question becomes, who actually figured this out? Why were China and Europe, 2 very different regions with very different politics, cultures, and histories, able to build high-speed rail systems that transformed the way their people move? And why did those same factors never take root in the United States? To answer this, we need to look at what these places got right and why America's strengths turned into disadvantages when it came to building high-speed rail. Let's start with the most dramatic example, China. No country in modern history has built infrastructure as quickly or as aggressively as China did between 2005 and 2020. In just 15 years, China laid more than 26,000 miles of high-speed rail, enough track to cross the continental United States 10 times. And they did it with the level of speed, central coordination, and single-direction momentum that simply does not exist in America. China's secret wasn't just money. It was a combination of factors the United States fundamentally lacks. First, a centralized planning system that makes rapid decisions. When China decides to build a rail corridor, there is no decade-long debate, no series of lawsuits, no political stalemate between states and federal agencies. The decision is made, the land is acquired, and construction begins. Second, China has enormous clusters of densely populated cities concentrated in the same regions, meaning almost any line built will immediately have millions of potential riders. And third, high-speed rail in China isn't only a transportation project, it's a national symbol, it's prestige, it's geopolitical messaging. The point isn't for every line to turn a profit on day one. The point is to unify domestic markets, strengthen national identity, and project global power. America, by contrast, builds infrastructure almost exclusively through the lens of cost-benefit analysis. And that difference in purpose changes everything. There's also the economic side. China's labor costs in the 2000s and early 2010s were far lower than those in the United States. Land acquisition was easier, political resistance was minimal, and legal challenges were almost non-existent. In America, a single homeowner can delay a project for years.
In China, the project moves forward whether individuals resist or not. You may agree or disagree with that system, but it undeniably makes building high-speed rail dramatically faster. And in China's case, it made the impossible look routine. Europe, meanwhile, represents a completely different path to success, one rooted not in speed or centralized authority, but in geography, culture, and decades of consistent policy. Europe didn't need a political revolution to build high-speed rail. The continent was already perfectly structured for it. Dense cities, short distances, centuries of train culture. People already trusted rail as their default mode of travel long before the first high-speed train ever launched. The European Union also treats public transportation as a public good. Governments subsidize it heavily, maintain stable funding, and coordinate cross-border projects with long-term planning in mind. European cities, unlike their American counterparts, were not redesigned around cars. They stayed narrow, walkable, and connected, which made high-speed rail a natural extension of how Europeans already lived. And because many European countries stretch vertically, Italy, Spain, France, even the UK to some degree, their geography conveniently forms long, straight corridors ideal for fast trains. Europe also faced a unique competitor, short-haul aviation. For decades, flights between major European cities were frequent, expensive, and time-consuming when factoring in airport security and transfers. High-speed rail didn't have to dominate every market. It just had to be faster, more comfortable, and more reliable than regional flights. And it was. In many parts of Europe, high-speed rail crushed domestic air travel so effectively that airlines either shrank dramatically or partnered with rail companies instead. The success wasn't because Europe was richer or more advanced than the United States. It was because Europe's geography, transportation culture, and political priorities aligned perfectly with what high-speed rail needed to thrive. To really understand the gap between America and the rest of the world, though, you have to look at the comparison from three angles. The first is population and density. Europe and China have tight clusters of cities and hundreds of millions of people living along narrow corridors. The United States has the opposite. Distant cities separated by enormous stretches of land and suburban regions that sprawl outward instead of upward. High-speed rail loves density. America spreads it out. The second angle is politics and land. China and much of Europe can acquire land quickly, either through strong government power or cooperative public policy. In the United States, land acquisition is slow, adversarial, and expensive. One country can say, "We're building this," and begin next month. The other needs environmental reviews, negotiations, hearings, lawsuits, reevaluations, redesigns, and years of waiting. That difference isn't ideological, it's structural. And the third angle is cost and investment. Europe and China build rail cheaply enough that even marginal lines can make economic sense. America builds so expensively that even great projects fail before they begin. Investors won't risk billions when every mile can balloon into tens of millions of dollars. The math simply doesn't work. This is what makes the comparison so striking. China and Europe didn't build high-speed rail because they wanted to show up the United States. They built it because their geography, their politics, their culture, and their cost structures all supported it. America isn't broken. America simply operates on a different foundation, one that doesn't reward high-speed rail the way other regions do. And that leads to the real conclusion of this section. It's not that America doesn't want high-speed rail, it's that America was never built for it. If the past explains how America got here and the present shows why the country is stuck, then the future asks the most important question of all. Can the United States actually change its trajectory? And surprisingly, despite decades of delays, lawsuits, canceled projects, and political gridlock, the answer is maybe. Because even in the middle of all the setbacks, a handful of high-speed rail projects are quietly moving forward, slowly, painfully, and expensively, but moving nonetheless. The most famous, of course, is California high-speed rail. No project in America represents both ambition and dysfunction more clearly. It is the most expensive rail project in the world, the slowest to be built, and the most heavily criticized. Deadlines slipped, lawsuits piled up, budgets exploded, and yet in the heart of the Central Valley, the first physical segment is already taking shape. Concrete viaducts rising out of farmland, long stretches of graded earth, and tracks that will one day carry trains faster than anything America has ever seen. It may be messy, it may be flawed, but it is real, and in the United States, that alone is historic. Then there is the Dallas-Houston corridor, Texas Central Railway. On paper, it is the perfect American high-speed rail line. 2 massive metro areas, a straight geographic corridor, the right distance, the right demand, and a partnership with Japanese Shinkansen technology. In any other developed country, this line would have been finished already. But in the United States, it has spent years trapped in legal battles, land disputes, and regulatory delays. Its future flickers between hope and uncertainty, a project half bright, half shadow, waiting for a political and financial breakthrough. And finally, there is Brightline Florida, arguably the most successful passenger rail project in modern American history. It runs fast, privately operated trains, it has reached speeds of 125 miles per hour, and it has already connected Miami to Orlando and has plans to push west toward Tampa. For the first time in decades, Americans can buy a ticket, sit down, and travel between major cities on a train that feels modern, clean, and competitive. Brightline is not perfect, but it is proof that high-speed rail, or at least something close to it, can exist in the American market. And most importantly, it is profitable enough to attract private investment, something California and Texas have struggled to achieve. These projects matter not because they are massive, but because they still exist. Because despite every structural obstacle, there are forces pushing America closer to rail than at any time in the last 50 years. The U.S. population is booming in the Sun Belt, Texas, Florida, Arizona, exactly where rail projects could work. Younger Americans, especially Gen Z, are driving less than previous generations and showing a clear preference for walkability, transit, and urban living. The federal government has injected $66 billion into rail through the 2021 Infrastructure Act, the largest investment since Amtrak was created. And globally, new construction technologies have brought down the cost of building high-speed rail by 20 to 30% compared to a decade ago. The world is changing, and for once, the United States might be changing with it. So what would America actually look like in 2050? Realistically, it won't resemble China's vast national network. That scale is impossible under America's political and geographic constraints. But the country could absolutely support 2 to 5 functional high-speed corridors: Dallas to Houston, Los Angeles to Las Vegas, Miami to Orlando to Tampa. And perhaps the most iconic of all, the Northeast Corridor upgraded to true high-speed standards, with trains running 200 miles per hour between Washington, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. Not a national grid, not a revolution, but a meaningful step forward, one that would reshape the way millions of Americans travel. Which brings us to the final and most important question. High-speed rail isn't just an engineering challenge. It isn't just about concrete, tracks, or politics. It's about choice. It's about what kind of country Americans want to live in. Should the U.S. pursue high-speed rail at any cost, even if it means spending hundreds of billions of dollars? Should it focus instead on the industry it already dominates, the aviation sector, and simply double down on airports and airlines? Will the next generation of Americans reshape the culture of driving or cling to the traditions of the open road? And perhaps the deepest question of all, is the United States willing to pay the enormous price required to build a transportation future that looks anything like Europe or Asia? Because in the end, high-speed rail isn't really about trains. It's about identity. It's about priorities. It's about the future of America.